the Pentagon, how it was built. We'll talk about some of the events that influenced what happened on 9/11. We'll talk about 9/11, and then we'll talk about the memorial. So it's kind of broken down into 4 parts. So again, here we talk about the fact that when George Bush, when he dedicated the 9/11 memorial, he said the following: "One of the worst days in American history, some of the bravest acts in American history. We will always honor those heroes of 9/11, and here in this hallowed place, we pledge that we will never forget their sacrifice." So to kind of start this whole presentation, I like to start with the numbers. So let's try to figure out what exactly happened on September 11th, 2001. So 2,996 people were killed on September 11th, 2001 due to the terrorist attacks. 265 were killed on 4 planes. 2,606 were killed in the World Trade Center. Out of those, 343 were New York City firemen. 72 were law enforcement. More than 90% of those who died were at or above the impact zone for both planes. At least 200 people either jumped or fell from the World Trade Center. 1,642 victims have been positively identified through DNA. The fires burned at the World Trade Center until December 20th, 2001. So for 2 months after the events of 9/11, there were still fires that were burning down on the World Trade Center. 125 people were killed at the Pentagon. Of those, 55 were military personnel. So let's talk about kind of the timeline. So how did the events of 9/11 start? At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines departs Boston bound for Los Angeles. At 8:15, United Flight 175 departs Boston bound again for Los Angeles. At 8:20, American Airlines Flight 77 departs Washington Dulles bound for Los Angeles. At 8:42, United Flight 93 departs Newark bound for San Francisco. And you can see the difference. The morning flights left at 9 o'clock, but the Flight 93 didn't leave until 8:42 a.m. They were all supposed to leave at 8 o'clock. The difference was there were delays at Newark Airport. At 8:46 a.m., American Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 9:03 a.m., United Flight 173 crashes into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 9:37 a.m., American Flight 77 crashes into the western facade of the Pentagon. 9:42 a.m., FAA grounds all flights, and all flights are to land immediately. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. At 10:03 a.m., United Flight 93 crashes into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. 9:29 a.m., the Tower of the World Trade Center collapses along with the Marriott Hotel, which is kind of at the bottom of the World Trade Center. And then finally in the evening at 5:21, 7 World Trade Center finally collapses. And that's kind of the end of the destruction that happened on the events of September 11th. So again, how I came up with this presentation is really, it's all me. So I developed it. I decided what were the important points, so on and so forth. So people can disagree as to what the salient points are. This is from my perspective. So we're kind of going to start with what happens, this building of the Pentagon. Why was the Pentagon built? And interestingly enough, they broke ground on the Pentagon on September 11th, 1941. So literally you fast forward almost 70 years later and the Pentagon is attacked. But they actually broke ground on September 11th, 1941. Then we're going to talk about the events that occurred in February of 1993. That was when the World Trade Center was bombed. We're going to talk about those events. And then we're going to talk about the reconstruction of the Pentagon, which started basically in earnest in 1994. And then we're going to talk about the Oklahoma City bombing, which is something you may not connect with all of the events that led up to 9/11, but I'm going to show you how all these events connect. And then obviously we're going to talk about September 11th, 2001. Does anyone have any idea who this individual is? He's an extremely influential individual whose name you probably are not that familiar with. So Robert, if anybody puts his name in the chat, you want to read those out loud? He's a very important individual, a huge impact on the 20th century. So again, I'm going to ask questions as we go through this presentation. Please go ahead and add any comments you have into the chat room, and then Robert is going to read those, and we'll see if any of you are familiar with these individuals who I'm going to mention. Okay, it looks like we don't have any comments. Robert?
We did get an answer for General Groves.
Wow. Okay, I'm impressed. Whoever came up with that one, you know your history. For those of you who have never heard of him, I'm not surprised. His name is Lieutenant General Leslie Groves. He was an extremely important individual because of two different reasons. The first reason, well, first of all, he was born in August of 1896. He was the son of a U.S. Army chaplain and graduated 4th from his class at West Point in 1918, which of course is right as World War I is ending. In August of 1941, he was appointed to manage the construction project that is now known as the Pentagon. He later recalled that he was hoping to get into the war theater so he could, quote, find a little peace. So that's how crazy it was trying to get the Pentagon up and off the ground. Eventually, he was removed from building the Pentagon because he was assigned to a new project, and his new project would be known as the Manhattan Project. Why is the Manhattan Project so important? When I say the Manhattan Project, what am I referring to?
Deirdre, while people are thinking about that one. So on the previous one, I have to give a shout out to Ken and Rose. They both answered Leslie Groves was the answer to the previous question.
That's impressive, because I didn't know who he was until I started doing these presentations. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, the Manhattan Project, that is the building of the first atomic bomb. The gentleman is most closely associated with the building of the Manhattan Project, a gentleman known as Oppenheimer. He was the scientist who basically came up with it, but the only way to get this built in wartime was to partner with the military. And it was Leslie Groves that kept on going back to Washington saying, we need more money, we need more this, we need these more people, we need more security clearances, all these things. He was responsible for basically the day-to-day operations of how do you get from the paperwork all the way to obviously producing the bomb. And of course, this had an enormous influence once the bomb was released and people saw its constructive power. It had a huge influence on world affairs from there on out. Leslie Groves died in July of 1940 in Washington, D.C. Now let's talk about how we built the Pentagon. So the Pentagon, this is a very odd history when you think about just the building, how you build the Pentagon. And I apologize, the picture is a little bit clearer on my screen. I guess when it's smaller, it's the pixels are a little bit better. But basically, the architect was a guy by the name of George Bernstrom, and he had 3 days to come up with the design for a building that would accommodate 40,000 employees and 10,000 cars. And he was very limited in what space he had available to come up with this massive project. And in addition to that, he had an enormous problem because of the lack of steel. Now, in 1941, why would we have so little steel in the United States? I mean, the United States was the largest producer of steel in the world. Why in 1941 would we have such a problem with dedicating steel to the building of the Pentagon? What was going on that we would have so little steel in the United States that would be available? So while you're thinking about that question, now the land in which the Pentagon is currently built on was owned at one point by the family of Robert E. Lee. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, Robert E. Lee was a very famous general who fought for the South during the Civil War. And his family, or his wife's family more, owned a lot of land, what is now Arlington, Virginia, and then eventually the land where the Pentagon would be built. So originally it was owned by the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. It was sold multiple times, but at that point, right around 1941, it was an airfield. So it was actually owned by the federal government. So it was kind of easy for them to kind of move some people around and put the Pentagon there. And one of the things that when they came up with why did they end up with the construct and what they had? Well, first of all, they got 3 days to come up with it, but it actually reminded him a lot of Civil War forts. A lot of forts were built in and around Washington, D.C. to protect it from any invading army from the South. So it actually, a lot of them had 5 sides. So they liked the idea of the 5 sides. And also there were 3 roads, major roads that kind of revolved around where the Pentagon was. So to build it on 5 sides would obviously accommodate the roads. But on top of that, it reminded, for example, Roosevelt, who personally approved the construction or approved the architecture. Basically, he liked it because it reminded him of a Civil War fence. Now, it also was going to have 5 stories, and it was going to have 5 sides. So why was there so little steel available? Did anyone answer that question? The reason why there was so little steel in 1941 is because we were using all the steel that we had to build ships. So steel was coming off of the assembly lines as quickly as possible, but most of it was being used to build all of the ships that it could. Now, at the time, we were not part of the war. World War II started for the United States in December of 1941, but even then we were involved in what was called the Land Lease. So we were supplying ships and other items to Great Britain, who was obviously involved in the war starting in 1939. So we were supplying steel to our allies, hence the reason we had so little steel to support the building of the Pentagon. And this is going to become very important later as we talk about the events of 9/11. So hence the reason it had 5 sides. It can only be 5 stories. You can't build a building in today's modern age without steel. And so if you're going to build a building that's mostly made of concrete, you can't have it be very tall because you don't have those steel beams to support the weight. So the Pentagon was built with very few elevators. It had mostly ramps going up and down. There was no escalators. Of course, they didn't really exist at that time. And that building was thrown up. So it started construction on September 11th, 1941. It was finished in January of 1943. And even before it was even completely built, there were already people inside. So they were working in the Pentagon while it was being built at the same time. So now one of the very interesting things about the Pentagon, there are a lot of different interesting developments. At one point, there was only 1 elevator in the building, and that was for the Secretary of Defense. There were no other elevators. Everybody else walked up and down stairs or up and down ramps. Now, it was a very interesting, the Pentagon has twice as many bathrooms as is actually needed. Why would that be? That's such an odd concept. Why would a building that you're throwing up and getting into as quickly as possible, why would you explicitly design it so it would have twice as many bathrooms as what would be necessary in any sort of military base? Anyone know why it would need so many bathrooms and explicitly designed to have that many bathrooms? Anyone want to hazard a guess? What was going on in 1941 when this was built that it would need twice as many bathrooms as you would think? Robert, do we have any answers?
You know, Deirdre, so I have 2 computers running, but I have them in separate rooms so that the sound doesn't interfere between the 2. So I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between computers. So what was the question?
The question was why was the Pentagon built with twice as many bathrooms as what was needed?
Oh, I see. Let's see. I don't see. A lot of people have been answering the question so far. So we have the chat turned off just for security purposes for the time being, but we are monitoring that. So we haven't gotten any. We've gotten a lot of answers back from some of the previous questions, but not so much on this one just yet.
Well, the reason is in 1941, there were Jim Crow laws, which were segregated bathrooms were necessary in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now, this was being built in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was being built by the federal government, but at the time, the federal government respected local laws, especially things that were built in the South. So we were going to have segregated facilities in federal buildings. But Virginia was not happy with this, but you're like, I don't care, get it up. But in the end, prior to it even being opened, basically the general who was in charge of the building said, we aren't doing it this. We're not in the middle of the war. We're not dealing with this. So there was never actually segregated bathrooms in the Pentagon. They were built to have that. And they were at one point, you had the signs over there, but they were never actually implemented. So you never had segregated bathrooms inside the Pentagon. They were built so you could, but it was never actually implemented. Now, in theory, when you walk through the Pentagon, you can basically, in theory, it's possible to get from one end of the building to the other in under 10 minutes. So some of it requires a shortcut. You cut through the opening of the courtyard, which is at the center of the Pentagon. As you can see here, it's this area here that it will later become the center courtyard of the Pentagon. Can you actually do that? Well, it depends. Some people have been able to pull it off, but they're walking really fast, or maybe running is the right word. So when this Pentagon was built,
just to interrupt you real quick. So we had some good answers. So a few people did answer the segregation, but we had some other good guesses. There was one, female construction workers, and then also tornado shelters.
That was a good one. I would not have thought of, no, there were definitely, there's always male and female bathrooms in the Pentagon, but they did have at one point colored female bathrooms and then white female bathrooms, colored male bathrooms, and then white bathrooms. But this was never actually, there was never any requirement within the Pentagon. So once you started working in the Pentagon, they basically just took the signs down. They're like, we're not doing this. We're in the middle of the war. We got too many other things to worry about. We're not implementing this. Now, Virginia was not happy at the time, but it was a federal building and they really had no control over it. Now, costs were actually, it cost about $63 million to build at the time. That's about basically a little under $1 billion in today's money. So that's the construction of the Pentagon. Now, by 1992, the Pentagon is showing its age. So for those of you who are alive and remember, in 1990, 1991, we had the Persian Gulf War. And, you know, if you remember anything about the Persian Gulf War, what you remember is, of course, how technological it all was and smart bombs and all these things happening. And then, of course, you're looking at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is just showing its age. Remember, it was thrown up in 1941. They have done very little construction on it since. And there's really, they're focusing attention. We've got this very modern, technologically advanced military, and they're working in this building that doesn't have central air, central heat. It's a mess. So actually a trial balloon gets floated. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term trial balloon, the idea is that somebody kind of leaks an idea to the media. And the idea was it would actually be cheaper to tear down the Pentagon and start all over. So instead of trying to fix it and add the technology that's needed and the fax machines and the internet and all the things that are needed for a modern army, it's really cheaper just to tear it down and start over. So what happens instead is in 1992, the Pentagon is declared a national landmark. Once it is declared a national historical landmark, you cannot make any changes to the exterior of the Pentagon. So you're now stuck. There's no other options. You can't tear it down. You have to take the building as it is and basically figure out how to fix it and make it what you want without really touching the exterior of the building or changing its architectural designs. So in 1994, plans begin in earnest for the reconstruction and the technological upgrades to the Pentagon building. So let's move ahead here on our timeline. So is anyone familiar with this particular individual? So Robert, if you can monitor the chat room, I apologize. I can't see the chat room and my slides and somehow all at the same time. I need a third screen.
It's okay. You know, it's going to be a challenge for me to answer the questions because I'm going back and forth between the two rooms because of the way I have the screen set up.
Let me see if I can pull that up. I think if I minimize something, I'm going to lose the presentation, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can just roll with your presentation if you want to and just skip the questions.
Okay. So this gentleman is by the name of Ramzi Youssef. He was born in Kuwait to parents from Pakistan in April of 1968. He graduated from, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, a Swana Institute in the UK with a degree in electrical engineering. Now, he is very important because he created the car bomb for the first World Trade Center. So in 1993, February of 1993, a bomb goes off in the World Trade Center. 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 people were injured. So he built a very large bomb and he put it into a truck, and then he drove the truck into the parking garage at the World Trade Center. And he parks it as close as he can to a pillar. And then he leaves the Pentagon, he leaves the World Trade Center. And he basically has it on a timer, and then eventually the bomb does go off. So here's his plan. So here are the two buildings right next to each other. So his plan is to do it way down in the bottom of the building, and he's going to set off the bomb. And this building's going to start to collapse. It's going to go into this building, and then both buildings are going to end up in the Hudson. His plan was thwarted because he put the parking garage pretty close to a window. And basically the explosion went out of the window and didn't necessarily impact the integrity of the building. So basically the World Trade Center stood, as did the second one. So anyone who was in the vicinity of the blast was killed. And then most of the injuries of people who were basically trying to escape from the building once the fire alarms and there was an explosion in the building and there was some panic trying to get out of the building in February of 1943. So the World Trade Center in 1993 sets off this massive criminal investigation into who did the bombing. And in the meantime, the bomber, the person who created the bomb, who's Ramzi Youssef, he escapes from the United States and he flies to the Philippines of all places. So in 1993, he's one of the most wanted terrorists in the world, and he is currently in the Philippines. And the United States authorities do not know where he is. So while he is in the Pentagon, or while he's in the Philippines, he's working on a new plot. And his new plot is the word pajanga is what's going to be used to be associated with this particular plot. So in December of 1941, he basically has this idea. He's going to create liquid bombs. So he's going to take devices, kind of look like this, and he's going to plant them with explosives, and he's going to set a timer on them. So he's going to get on the aircraft. He's going to leave his bottle behind. It's going to explode. He'll get on the aircraft. He'll fly to an intermediate location. He gets off of the aircraft. The plane takes off again. The bomb explodes. So that is his plan. He actually is fairly successful. In December of 1994, he boards a flight from Manila to Japan. He gets off on a planned layover in Korea and leaves the bomb on board. A passenger is killed, but the bomb ends up landing safely. Now, based on this trial run, he knows two things. One, he can get the bomb past security. And number two, it's not big enough. He needs it to be bigger because it killed the passenger who was actually sitting on the seat, but otherwise the plane landed safely. So now he's got to figure out how to build this bomb bigger and somehow still get it past security. So he wants to put on 11 different aircraft. He wants to put bombs on board them, and he's going to have his friends and his associates get on the aircraft with him and then fly to an intermediate location, get off the aircraft, and then those flights would continue flying to the United States and basically blow up and crash into the Pacific Ocean. So this is his plan in January of 1995. But there's a problem. He's thwarted. And the problem he has is he has all of these explosives and all these different chemicals in his apartment in Manila, the Philippines, and they catch on fire. And when they catch on fire, that means that the firemen arrive, the police arrive, and they're like, okay, there's something funky going on here. I've never seen these kind of chemicals. I don't know what's going on here. They actually get a search warrant, and they come in and they find his computer. And on his computer is basically laid out his plans. The officials in the Philippines get the United States FBI involved, the FBI gets involved, and suddenly we're off to the races. We're trying to figure out who he is, where he is, how many bombs he's got, have they already been planted, how far along is this plot? Have we gotten to the point that we're still in the planning stages, or are we in the implementation phase? That's what they're trying to figure out. In the meantime, the then FAA is basically coming up with all of these directives to make sure that no bombs can basically get on board flights from the Philippines to the United States. Now, he ends up escaping. So one of his colleagues is actually arrested, one of the gentlemen he's sharing the apartment with, but he escapes. He ends up in Pakistan, where he's eventually arrested about a year later, and he's turned over to the US authorities. He has been arrested, and he's currently in a supermax prison in Colorado. He's there to this day. So Ramzi Youssef is a very interesting player because he kind of sets up what happens on 9/11. He's a minor player, but he has a big role to play. Now, this gentleman, a lot of people are familiar with him or have seen his picture somewhere. For those of you who don't know who he is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He is considered the principal architect of the events of 9/11. Now, the interesting thing to me is he is also this gentleman's uncle. So Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed are related. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is the uncle, and then Ramzi Youssef is the nephew. But they're only 5 years apart in age, so they're really raised almost as brothers. And at some point, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed actually is in the Philippines and is working with Ramzi Youssef on the Pechenka plot. He was not in the Philippines when the Pechenka plot was thwarted. He was already back, we think, in Pakistan, but it's not really clear. So Ramzi Youssef, or I'm sorry, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM as he's referred to by the military, was born in either 1964 or 1965 in Pakistan. He traveled to the United States and graduated from North Carolina Agriculture and Technical State University with a mechanical engineering degree in 1968. So his role, basically, he's the one who did 9/11. He basically came up with the idea, went to Osama bin Laden, got the funding, personally recruited the pilots who would later crash into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and he really set the whole thing in motion. So what did he learn from Ramzi Youssef? He learned the following: the World Trade Center is a really good target. Let's go get it. The second thing he learned was, let's use the planes. The planes are a really good idea. Let's try to come up with something similar. The third thing he learned was explosives make it too complicated. You add explosives into the mix, suddenly your chances of getting caught go up considerably. So how do you basically come up with a plan in which planes are good, the World Trade Center is a good target, and we're going to not use explosives? And based on these ideas, he came up with what was referred to as the planes plan. And that was the plan that he basically presented to Osama bin Laden, and Osama bin Laden came up with the funding, and then basically that was used for the events of September 11th. Now, all in all, the entire attack cost about $1 million. That's how much actually cash was used by the 9/11 hijackers to come to the United States to get flight training and then carry out the events of 9/11. Between September 11th and the end of the end of December, the United States spent $20 billion on basically recovery on 9/11 and then the military operations that occurred in Afghanistan following the events of September 11th. So in 3 months, the United States had $20 billion. The terrorists spent about $1 million. So that's really a huge difference in how much money was spent, obviously, on the attack versus the response thereof. And that's just in the first 3 months. That's how much money was spent. Now, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was eventually captured in March of 2003. He was captured in Pakistan, and he's turned over to U.S. authorities. So let's kind of focus now on domestic issues. So this gentleman is by the name of Timothy McVeigh, and he was convicted of the truck bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people were killed and 680 people were injured. This was a big deal in the United States, and this happened in April of 1995. And really what this did is it really changed the thinking of the United States as far as security. So one of the big things that changes, for example, for those of you who have seen some of the events that are occurring in and around the White House, there used to be a road that went right through what was between the White House and Lafayette Park. That was a road and people could drive on it, and that was Pennsylvania Avenue, hence the term 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That closed really permanently because of fear of a truck bomb. And it really is going to start the Pentagon planners reconsidering how they're going to revitalize the Pentagon and how they're going to plan to minimize damage that's caused by a truck bomb. So if you have a truck bomb the size in which Timothy McVeigh came up with in April of 1995, and you're rebuilding the Pentagon, how are you going to prevent or minimize the damage done by a truck bomb at the Pentagon? So this is really going to start a security thinkers, you know, everyone who's involved in kind of security in Washington, D.C., at both the state or the federal level and at the military, how are you going to minimize the damage that is caused by a truck bomb of this size if it's used in attack against a federal building, let's say in Washington, D.C.? So when they start revitalizing the Pentagon, they're going to add new security features. And these new security features are going to include steel, they're going to include bomb-resistant windows, and they're going to include fire sprinklers. Now, if you think of when this was built in 1941, there were no fire sprinklers. This was a whole new invention that kind of came out after the 60s and was required in buildings. It was not required in older buildings that had been built at the same time as the Pentagon. So we're going to add, not only are we going to add new technology, we're also going to add new security features to the Pentagon. Now, the steel is very important. So what they're going to do is the exterior level, which is known as the E-ring. The E-ring is going to be reinforced with steel. And if you think of steel, they're going to make it in like the form of a net, which is going to be very important on the events of September 11th. They're also going to put blast-resistant windows. Now, one of the other terrorist attacks that occurred between 1995 and then in 2001 was the attack on the American embassies in Africa. And most of the injuries that occurred at those buildings when the bomb went off was the flying glass. So putting in the blast-resistant windows is really going to prevent injuries to people's eyes and faces with flying glass everywhere. And it's also, of course, the fire extinguisher, the fire sprinklers is going to be very, very helpful in suppressing any fire that could be as a result of some sort of an attack against the Pentagon. Now, the renovations are going to occur by wing. We're going to show you a graphic later on that's going to show you what I mean. So if you think of the Pentagon, we're going to slice it into 5 pieces of pie. So the Pentagon, think of it as round. This is wedge 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to take wedge 1 and we're going to kick everybody out. So everybody who works in wedge 1 is going to leave their offices and they're going to work for the next year in office buildings in Crystal City, which is basically across the street. So they're going to completely leave their offices. They're taking their computers, all their equipment, everything's they're out of here. And then for a year, there are going to be construction guys in there. They're pulling out wires. They're adding new wires. They're adding the internet. All the things in which a modern military is going to need is going to be added, and nobody's going to be working in wedge 1 while this is going on. This is going to be very important later. So they're going to start near the heliport on the western facade. So as we get closer to the events of September 11th, 2001, wedge 1 is finished. But if you are a tenant and you have been working in Pentagon or in Crystal City for a year, you are in no hurry to go back to the Pentagon. They have usually gyms, they have nice facilities, their air conditioning always works. It's much nicer than it is to work in the Pentagon. Nobody's in any hurry to come back. So on September 11th, that particular wedge 1 was basically empty. So you had the people who were slowly trickling back, but for the most part, really nobody wanted to be back in the Pentagon. So on September 11th, 2001, wedge 1 basically had empty cubes. This is going to be very important considering there are about 20,000 employees who work every day in the Pentagon. Okay, so let's talk about 9/11. Now, we are really focusing in on the Pentagon. We've kind of talked briefly about what happened in New York. I feel that there's a lot of information about what happened in New York. We are focusing exclusively on what happened at the Pentagon. So, American Airlines Flight 77, which is taken off from Washington Dulles Airport, basically starts flying west. It gets about as far as Pittsburgh and then basically does this rapid U-turn and starts heading back towards Washington, D.C. There are 64 people on board. There are 336,000 pounds of jet fuel. And when it hits the Pentagon, it is going 530 miles per hour. So for those of you who are familiar with DC, it follows what's called 395, which is I-395 kind of goes around the Pentagon. So it goes around the flight, we're talking about Flight 77. So here's the Pentagon. That's going to come roaring up 395, and it's going to make this weird right turn following the highway. And then it's going to follow the highway into Washington, D.C. over the 14th Street Bridge. And then eventually it's going to come back around, and then it's going to go into the side of the Pentagon. It's going to go into the western side of the Pentagon. And again, it's going 530 miles an hour once it hits. Now, they had, after the events of 9/11, they had a lot of simulators. They had pilots basically from all over the country simulate what happened and to see if they could get a plane to go 530 miles an hour and go into the Pentagon. Most of the pilots that did this particular scenario ended up in the ground. Very few were able to maintain their basically their trajectory and go into the Pentagon. The Pentagon is only 5 stories tall. And at that speed, it would be very difficult for him to actually hit the Pentagon and not the ground. But the pilot was fairly sophisticated and managed to actually go right into the side of the Pentagon. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories. Okay. But some of the people who actually witnessed it was a gentleman by the name of a Catholic priest by the name of Father Stephen McGraw. He was on his way to Arlington Cemetery to conduct a funeral when he saw the plane go over his car and then hit some lamppost and then finally crash into the Pentagon. He abandoned his car and spent the rest of the day with the injured and basically providing the first responders comfort to those that he could. This is Father right here. You can see him with his purple I forget what that's called around his neck. So some of the other stories of survivors and heroes, I got a lot of information from watching a documentary basically created by PBS, and it's called 9/11, the Pentagon. And it is available for those of you who want to watch it and you have Amazon Prime, it is available on Amazon Prime. And it has a lot of really great information about people who were inside the Pentagon and their stories of survival. And one of the people that they focus on is Lieutenant Colonel Marion Willis. Now, she was basically in a meeting and her entire conference room caught on fire. Now, that would have been an enormous shock. But she managed to crawl with several others in the pitch black. So basically, the whole room, first you have this huge glow, and then the entire building, the entire room you were in burst into flames. So basically everybody got down on their hands and knees because there's more air at the bottom than there is at the top. If you're standing, you get down on your hands and knees, and they grabbed the ankle of the person in front of them. And then they just crawled as far as they could, and they picked up kind of people along the way. And it's very disorienting. They had just arrived back in the Pentagon. They weren't familiar with the building at all. It's not as if they'd been there for years. And they were trying to figure out how to get to an exit. And finally, somebody sees light. And they can see a pinprick of light coming out of a window. And they say, okay, we have found a window. So they start making their way towards the window. They get to the window, and what is the problem with the window? The window is blast resistant, which means it hasn't shattered, it hasn't moved, and it is still intact, which is great because there's less flying debris, but this is their escape route, and it has blast resistant glass on it. So actually, one of the Marines who was with a lieutenant colonel takes a printer, throws it at the window, and literally it bounces off the window and comes back towards them. And the colonel's beside herself. She's like, I've taken these people and I've gotten them out of harm's way and I've gotten them to this window, and we're going to die here, so close to getting the exit. And then finally, they realized that basically because of the heat, the area around the window has become loose. So they're actually able to dig their way the window out, and finally got rid of kind of what was holding it in place and managed to push the window out. So now the window is on the ground, and people who are below them can look up and see that there are people in the window. And so they're screaming to them, jump, jump, we will catch you, we're here. And so there are people saying, well, we need to go back. We need to there are the people who are survivors. And then finally, her superior officer says, I order you to jump out of the window. And she says, okay. She has no memory of dropping. She just remembers closing her eyes and falling. And she woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Washington, D.C. So if you jumped out of the World Trade Center in New York City on the events of September 11th, and over 200 people did, they fell to their deaths. If you managed to get to a window and you jumped out of the window in the Pentagon, the Marines were at the bottom of this and they caught you. Some of the other stories are Staff Sergeant Chris Bamer. He was a cook who worked in the Pentagon. And he, along with his Lieutenant Colonel Paul Anderson, they escaped the fire only to return multiple times. They kept on going back into the building to try to get people out. And they managed to save 3 people, got them out alive, and they did recover and managed to pull out 63 dead bodies. Eventually, he would receive the Purple Heart for his injuries, but he would be haunted, obviously, for what had happened to him on that day. Now, we talked about the fact that 120 people were killed at the Pentagon on the events of September 11th. A third of those were all in kind of one place, and that was called the Navy Command Center. So as what was happening in New York, basically, if you were in the Pentagon and you were in the Navy and you were a senior person, your idea was to run to the command center, because you have ships at sea and you need to tell them what to do, and you need to figure out which ships need to go to sea, where do they need to go, who needs to have, you know, gasoline, all those things. And so a lot of senior people at the Pentagon who were in the Navy rushed the Navy Command Center. They took a direct hit. And I want to say only 1 or 2 people survived. But most of the people who were in the Navy Command Center, and that particular center took a direct hit. So within minutes of the plane hitting the Pentagon, you know, everybody's coming in. So you got firefighters, they're arriving from, you know, from Northern Virginia. So they're coming from Fairfax, they're coming from the airport, they're coming from Fairfax County, they're coming from Mount Myers, ambulances, medical helicopters, regular helicopters. Everybody is just flooding to the Pentagon to see what they can do to help. Now, the military personnel are obviously trained to rush to the side of an incident. That is their job. That is what they do. That is their training. So, of course, you had military personnel who worked in the Pentagon, and they rushed to the impact zone. And even though there's this massive fire that has engulfed the western facade of the Pentagon, they are without gear, they are rushing in, and they're pulling people out, the injured, the dying, and the dead. So now this is about 30 minutes after the plane had been hit. The plane hits the Pentagon at 9:39 a.m. So by 10:10, the firefighters have a command center. And the command center was telling the military, you cannot go back into the Pentagon. It is unstable. You are going to get injured, and then we are going to have to go in and get you, the people you were trying to rescue, and you out. So the military guys who were there, when asked about it later, they're all kind of looking at each other. Firefighters are telling them they can't go in. And the military guys are looking at each other, and they all kind of have one thought. There's more of us than there are them. So basically, they were going to bum rush the firefighters and just basically go aside them and say, yeah, shoot me, I'm going. And basically, they were all about to go back in. And then all of a sudden, they hear this massive crack. And they watch as the E-ring collapses. Now, the E-ring is the exterior ring of the Pentagon. And it had a roof. And the roof has held for 40 minutes. But at 10:10 a.m., boom, the roof comes down. And so they're watching this going, okay, I guess we're not going back in after all. So they now concentrate on basically treating the injured that they have, and they're going to allow the firefighters who have all of their gear to basically go back into the Pentagon and try to get the injured out, as well as try to figure out how to attack this massive fire with all of this jet fuel. Now, everybody's coming in. We got everybody coming. We got the FBI has arrived. The National Transportation Safety Board has arrived. We're starting the investigation. We're trying to preserve the incident. We're trying to preserve basically parts of the plane, which are laying out on the ground. We're trying to figure out, you know, kind of how to conduct a full investigation into what happened at the Pentagon. However, a new threat is emerging. So basically around 9:20 a.m., everybody's, radio starts screaming. And it starts with the FBI guys. So the FBI guys, all of a sudden they start running. And if the FBI guys start running, you run with them. Do not be behind the FBI guys. If they start running away from something, go with them. So their radios are screaming. And the problem is that there is another plane that is inbound to the Washington, D.C. The FAA has advised the military that another plane has been hijacked and its last trajectory is Washington, D.C. Now, remember, 2 planes have hit the World Trade Center. It's logical then that a second plane is heading towards the Pentagon. One plane, both sides of the building. So the Arlington fire orders a complete evacuation of the Pentagon. Now, there is inside the Pentagon, there is basically a section of the building called the NMCC, which is known as the National Military Command Center. This is the heart of the Pentagon. Now, obviously, the US military has bases all over the world. It has submarines right now all over the world. If it basically abandoned the Pentagon, there'd be no one to contact at the Pentagon and say, what do I do? So they're not going anywhere. They have been told by the Arlington firemen, it's time to go. And they say, that's great. You guys leave. We're not going anywhere. They're like, yes, but another plane is going in and you might not survive. That's great. We aren't going anywhere. So in the meantime, however, there's smoke coming into the ventilation into the NMCC. So as a result of this, you have 6 basically contractors or people who work for the Pentagon. They're not military. They're basically the pipe fitters who work in the Pentagon. And they basically agreed to stay behind. And they're going to support the NMCC. And they're going to make sure that the water is pumping properly and to try to turn their ventilation off to stop the smoke from actually entering the NMCC. So they hear in their radios, you know, there's a plane incoming. It's 15 minutes out. It's 10 minutes out. It's 8 minutes out. And they have now realized that there's no time. They can't get out of the Pentagon in time. There's a plane headed towards them, and there's no way that they could actually get out of the Pentagon in time before the plane comes in. So they make their way to the courtyard, which is the center of the Pentagon. And basically there's 6 of them. They all get out on their knees and they all prepare for their deaths. In the meantime, there are 4 firefighters from Fairfax County who don't get the evacuation order in time. By the time they get their evacuation order, they're basically inside and they're hearing it over their radios too. You know, the plane is 3 minutes out, 2 minutes out, 1 minute out. And so they basically see these 6 Pentagon workers on their knees and they go over and they join them. So now you got 10 guys on their knees waiting for the Pentagon to get hit. In the meantime, the NMCC is hearing the same thing and they are not leaving. So they're in the NMCC and they're waiting for the second plane to come in. And then if you're inside inside the courtyard, you can hear it. Literally, there's nothing like the sound of a plane streaking towards you at that speed. It's no longer the radio screaming. They can hear the plane coming towards them. It is flying overhead. It's very fast speeds, and it's basically the sound has taken over all the other sounds that are associated with the fire and everything. All you can hear is the plane coming towards you. And here comes Penny. Can't make this stuff up. You would think that I did, but I did not. Basically, Lieutenant Penny, call sign Lucky, and her superior, Mark Sadsville, take off on their F-16s from Andrews Air Force Base to defend the Capitol against this new threat of hijacked U.S. commercial planes. By the time they get the order, there's no time to arm the planes. They know what they are being asked to do. They are being asked to take off with their planes, which have no armaments on them, no ability to shoot down an aircraft, and defend the U.S. Capitol at all costs. And they take off anyway. So now the plane, of course, that they're hearing at the Pentagon is literally Penny. It is not a second aircraft, a 4th air hijack. The 4th plane, Flight 93, in which they are concerned about, actually has already crashed in the fields of Pennsylvania. But the people in Washington, because of the technology and its limitations, they did not know that the plane had already crashed. The FAA had heard that a plane had crashed, but the communication wasn't instant. So they did believe a 4th plane was heading to Washington. They could hear it coming, but what they were actually hearing was the 2 F-16s, which had now taken defensive positions around Washington, D.C., and were prepared to defend Washington, D.C. with their lives. Now, Lieutenant Penny here goes on to serve 2 tours in Iraq in the wars that follow. So at 10:40, after they see the planes, the rescue operations resume inside the Pentagon. But at this point, they're really not finding people who have survived. Really, at this point, they're just finding people who have already deceased. At 12:16 p.m., the last commercial plane has officially landed in the United States. Now, the Pentagon never closes. The Pentagon they started working at the Pentagon in February of 1942. Operations have continued since then, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, ever since. The Pentagon never closes. There is always somebody working, multiple people, hundreds of people working at the Pentagon every day. COVID, 9/11, doesn't matter. Pentagon never stops. Now, the Secretary of Defense at that time is a gentleman by the name of Daniel Rumsfeld. Daniel Rumsfeld is a controversial character, but he had a very interesting day on the events of September 11th. He actually was in the Pentagon on 9/11. And he actually leaves the Pentagon. He's on the other side of the building. He leaves his side of the building and actually walks on the outside with his security people. And there are pictures of him actually helping the wounded, carry the wounded, onto ambulances or onto aircraft. And all I can think of is his security people must have been losing their minds. I mean, they got to get him out of here. There's something called a continuation of operations, coup plans. So basically, as part of the coup plan, you've got to get out of there. You're under attack. In order for the federal government to survive a nuclear attack, you are supposed to leave where you are and go to an alternate location. But Rumsfeld isn't going anywhere. He was in his 80s at the time. He's like, I'm not going anywhere. So he actually sends his deputy, a guy by the name of Paul Watzewitz, and he goes to the alternate location. When asked later why he didn't leave the Pentagon, he said, that's what deputies are for. At 10:43, Rumsfeld raises DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3. Now, DEFCON 1 is basically considered nuclear war. The last time that the DEFCON had been raised to level 3 was basically in 1973 during the Arab-Israeli War. So this is a very big deal. Now, 1 p.m., Rumsfeld is on the phone with the president, and he says, quote, "This is not a criminal action, this is war." This is a very different idea because in 1993, under the Clinton administration, they treated terrorist attack like a criminal act. And because it was considered a criminal act, it was basically the involvement of the FBI and not the military. Under the Bush administration, they're going to treat criminal acts as an act of war. And as a result of that, the military is going to play an enormous role in a response to what happens on the events of September 11th. On the same day, that evening, basically at 6:42 p.m., Rumsfeld holds a press conference inside the Pentagon and announces that the Pentagon will be in business tomorrow. Again, the Pentagon never closed. So there are about 10,000 workers who work at the Pentagon in any given day. So 125 of them were killed. Okay, so how did the other 19,000 and 800 people, how did they all survive? So let's talk about that. Now, this is a graphic that I pulled from the Los Angeles Times. And basically, we talked about earlier when they were doing the construction, they were going to do it per wedge. So as you can see here, this is wedge 1. So wedge 1 was completed their construction in September of 2001. So basically, this was still pretty empty on the events of September 11th. So here's where the plane comes in. It comes into basically the section of the Pentagon, which is still basically empty. Now that makes an enormous difference as to how many casualties. But as you can see, it works its way because of the plane trajectory, it works its way into wedge 2. So wedge 2 is actually being closed. So people are actually leaving wedge 2 in anticipation of the renovation. It's not completely closed, it's not empty, but it's probably not even halfway full. So the brunt of the damage is actually in wedge 1, and then some of the damage obviously is going to occur in wedge 2. And basically, as you can see here in this area here is where the Navy Command Center is. And then as you can see, they basically take the direct hit. So that's why a third of the people who were, or a little less than a third of the people who were killed, 20% of them were basically in the Navy Command Center because it was in this area here. So the plane takes, and again, the very important thing, and I'm going to skip here, is the steel. Now, this is the only picture that I could find on the internet. And let me tell you, I spent hours looking for it. But this is the only picture that I can find of the steel. And as you can see, it looks like netting. It actually kind of looks like a squid. But what it really is basically steel. So steel goes around and basically, if you think of it as a net. So if this is what the steel is and the plane tries to penetrate that net, it's going to bend in, but it is not, it's going to slow it down considerably. So the plane, instead of hitting concrete, hits steel. And what is a plane basically built of? It is built of aluminum. So aluminum hitting steel, believe me, the steel is going to win. And this is why the Pentagon, basically, even the E-ring, which takes the direct hit, that ceiling doesn't collapse for 40 minutes. And the reason it takes so long to collapse is because of the steel that is in here. And this is what prevents basically the plane from penetrating deeper into the building. So if we go back to this graphic here, the outer ring is the E ring, and then the ring here is the D ring, and then the C ring. So basically it penetrates the E ring, the D ring, and then the C ring. And then if we go to this slide, basically you will see this, what looks like a perfect ball here. Now, a lot of people have seen that picture and assume that that looks like what a missile hits, and it isn't. What it is the fireball. So if we think here, go back to this graphic, the plane is going to hit here. It's going to hit the steel of the E-ring and disintegrate. Basically, the plane is gone by the time it gets to the D-ring. It is completely gone. So what is continuing forward is the energy that is produced when steel basically hits a plane with all that fuel on board. So what is going to penetrate forward is going to be the fireball. So when you look at this image here, what you are looking at is basically the remnants of the fireball continuing. So once the fire starts, it basically gets more fuel because of all the furniture and all the other material that are in the Pentagon. They all catch on fire. It feeds the fire, and basically the fire will burn for several hours after the plane has hit. So again, it is the steel that prevents the plane from basically penetrating. If we go back one more slide here, and basically, as you can see here, this is the courtyard. So it doesn't actually penetrate all the way through the Pentagon. It's going to disintegrate here at the, it's only disintegrate by the E-ring. And the only thing that will basically hit the D-ring is this the fireball, which is going to leave this hole right here. So I am a big fan, because I remember I went to the 9/11 museum a couple of years ago in New York City. And while I was there, I saw the steel and I got all excited. I'm like, that's the steel. My friend's like, what are you talking about? I was like, that's the steel that saved the Pentagon. They have a piece of the steel. She's like, what steel? What are you talking about? Why are you so excited? I'm like, it's hard to explain how important steel was and how important it was to saving lives on the events of September 11th at the Pentagon. So let's talk about the Pentagon Memorial. Now, this was actually dedicated several years. When they started rebuilding the Pentagon, they basically started about 3 days after the end of the fire. A contract was basically put out. Several different companies won the contract, and basically workers were on site within days to rebuild. And they basically had 1 year. The decision was, is if you are going to reproduce the Pentagon, you are going to have it in working order. And on September 11th, 2002, workers will be working in the D-ring of the Pentagon where the plane hit. That is your goal. And as a result of this, basically most workers, they get the day of Christmas off, or they get Thanksgiving off. They basically had a vote. And the decision was, is we are not stopping. We are working on Christmas. We are working on Thanksgiving. We are working through all holidays. We are not going to stop work. We are going to have all of this done within 1 year of the events of September 11th. And that's that. And they made that happen. So let's talk about the Pentagon Memorial. Now, as you can see here, kind of in this picture, this is the Pentagon. And in front of the Pentagon, this is where the plane came in. So again, this is the western facade of the Pentagon. And basically they put here, which used to be a heliport where they landed helicopters, they instead now have the 9/11 Memorial. Now, there are 184 memorial benches dedicated to each individual, and it is organized by timeline by their age. So the youngest person was a child who was on board the aircraft. and her name was Dana Farkberg, and she was 3 years old. The oldest person who was also on board the aircraft was 71-year-old John, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Yamaki. I think that's how you pronounce it. Now, the benches that face the Pentagon, so these like here were people who were on board the aircraft. The benches that face out of the Pentagon were basically one of the 125 people who were killed inside the Pentagon. The architects were Julie Beckman and Keith Kessman. And basically they said in their words, they claim this ground in remembrance of the events of September 11th to honor the 184 people whose lives were lost, their families, and all those who sacrificed that we may live in freedom. We will never forget. And then this was dedicated by the president on September 11th, 2008. And almost every year, the US presidents will go on the events of September 11th. They will go to the Pentagon. And usually if you go there kind of later in the day, you will find President Bush. He usually does his best to come kind of unannounced on September 11th and make sure that he is there to talk to the people and talk to the military guys who were there that day as well. So let's talk about some conclusions. I have my own conclusions. A lot of people have their own conclusions, but these are mine. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's plans for 9/11 were based on what he learned from the failed Pajanka plot, which was set into motion in 1994 and 1995. The events in Oklahoma City, which were very tragic, and 168 people lost their lives in Oklahoma City, but I personally believe that what happened in Oklahoma City saved thousands of lives inside the Pentagon because of the new security measures that were put into place as a result. For example, the steel netting, the fire extinguishers, the fire sprinklers, as well as the blast resistant windows were put into place because of what happened in Oklahoma City in April of 1995. The renovation schedule for the Pentagon meant that the offices in Wedge 1 and Wedge 2 were basically empty on the events of September 11th. Now I say here would be vacant. They weren't completely vacant because 125 people were killed, but they could have been a lot more people working in the Pentagon on, or in that particular area of the Pentagon if it weren't for the renovation and how they ended up doing it. Now, the decision of the Bush administration to treat the acts of September 11th as an act of war instead of a criminal act has reverberations to this day. So a lot of our basically military structures and our foreign policy comes out of a result of what happened on September 11th and the military actions that were a result of what happened on 9/11. And that is my conclusions for today's presentation. Robert, do you have anything to add?
Where were you at on 9/11? I remember you told me this story a while back. I thought it was interesting.
I was working at the Department of Transportation. I was a federal employee. I was working on trains at the time. I would say that I graduated from choo-choo trains to airplanes, but I was working on train issues, and I was on my way to work, and I had heard that the Pentagon had been hit, and I called my mother on the phone. And I said, where are my two cousins? I had two cousins who worked in the World Trade Center, which is right next door. And she said, you know, they're fine. We've already heard from them. They're okay. And I said, okay, where are my brother and sister, who at that time both worked in New York City? She said, your brother's fine. We've talked to him. And I said, okay, well, where's my sister? She said, you're going to have to calm down. And I said, oh my God, where is my sister? And she said, she's on a plane. Her plane left Newark this morning, and it's heading for Los Angeles. But she's okay. I know she's okay. And I said, Mom, I don't know that. She's like, no. Mom's like, no, I've been praying. She's okay. I know she's okay. And I said, Mom, I don't know that. And her other line kept on ringing because everybody's calling to figure out what's going on. And I said, Mom, I'm just passing the Pentagon. I'm 5 minutes from the office. I will call you once I get inside. So I made my way into the office, parked my car in the building, and basically got up to my office and heard the Pentagon had been hit. Missed the whole thing. I must have been in the garage. I heard nothing. I didn't see it. So I have an intern in my office, and I had an attorney, and they both leave. You know, I have to make sure the intern's okay. You know, I'm a couple years older than she is at the time. I make sure she calls her mom. I make sure she calls her roommates. I say, do you want to come home with me? And she says, no. So she goes, and then I pick up the phone and call my mother. And my mother lets out what I call a primonial scream, the kind women give in childbirth, kind you see on television. And she's screaming into the phone. I don't know where Deirdre is. The last time I spoke to her, she was at the Pentagon. She's not answering the phone. I don't know what's going on. I said, Mom, this is Deirdre and I'm fine. She says, call your father. I can't talk. Because for those 5-10 minutes in which she couldn't get a hold of me, she was convinced that the plane that had hit the Pentagon was my sister's and we were both dead. My sister's plane, which had taken off from Newark, basically it was supposed to leave at 8 o'clock, the same time as Flight United 93. So they were both basically Flight United 93 and my sister's American airline planes were basically on the runway together at Newark Airport. And Flight 93 took off before my sister's did. And why the hijackers chose Flight United 93 bound for San Francisco and not my sister's flight heading to LA that was leaving at the exact same time is the difference between life and death. So we were very lucky that day. Both of my cousins who work at the World Trade Center, they survived. I have cousins who are New York City firemen. They both survived. And I have, I believe it or not, I had coworkers later who were working in the Pentagon and they both survived. So I personally was extremely lucky on the events of September 11th.
That's amazing. So these have been stopped because of COVID, but before the COVID situation broke out, you could go on tours of the Pentagon, and I'm sure at some point in time, those will start back up again. So once the world returns to normal, if you want to go on a tour of the Pentagon, I'm assuming that you'll be able to do that because I had done that twice myself.
Yes, I have as well.
In last years. And basically they had the information on the Department of Defense website and you go make a reservation and you give them your first name, your email address and some other stuff so they can make sure they check you out before you show up. But it's a really well done tour. It's they have, when I did it the last time, they had like, I think 4 different people from the different branches of the military, like 2 were Army, I think 1 was Navy, and I can't remember what the other one was. And they just walk you through the building and point stuff out. And the thing that in our group, people were surprised what certain sections of it looked like. There's a lot of people working in there and they can't necessarily all go out to lunch. So there's a lot of restaurants and stores and some people kind of like, wow, these hallways and these sections look like the shops and stores and stuff you'd see at an airport. Was kind
One of the big perks of working in the Pentagon is that there is basically a division of motor vehicles located right inside the Pentagon. So you don't have to take a day off work to basically go to the DMV. There's a section, there's basically an office right inside the Pentagon for that. But they also have fast food restaurants. They have sit-down restaurants. They have to because of the amount of time people left. Obviously, they couldn't get back in time for their shifts.
Right. So again,
one of the interesting stories that I learned when doing the tour was the term ground zero. So if we go back here, we have to go back several slides here, but if we go back to the center of the Pentagon, sorry, I'm going back quickly here, a bunch of slides. Basically, if we go back to the Cold War, in the very center of the Pentagon, there would have been a place where you could get a hot dog. It was like a hot dog stand in the courtyard. Sorry, I'm trying to go back to the pictures of the Pentagon itself. And so basically, here it is. So in here in the middle, basically it was a hot dog stand. You can go get, it was a steel, not even a steel, it was a concrete box. And the good weather, basically they would grill hot dogs and hamburgers out there. And there was always kind of a line of people, waiting outside to get a hot dog. Quick meal, it's very easy to get, chips and whatever, and Coke. And when the Soviets put satellites up and they would look and they would see this would look like a steel box in the middle of the Pentagon, they assumed that that was, for example, where the underground bunker was. So for years, the Soviets had one missile, and basically if World War III ever happened, that missile was going to hit right here. And it was going to take out the Pentagon. So there was one for Washington, D.C., and then there was another one just for this space right here. So in theory, an atom bomb would basically, or missile would be launched and it would hit this area right here. So after this information became declassified, they renamed this little, hot dog stand to Ground Zero. It kind of lost any funniness after 9/11, but that's what it was called. And you basically in the 10 years, 1993 up until 9/11, there was a hot dog stand by the name of Ground Zero in the center of the Pentagon. I just thought that was an interesting little story. I think I've gone over my time.
Oh, that's fine. I don't think anyone is complaining. One other question. So you mentioned earlier that they couldn't change the outside of the building because it got
Correct.
the historic designation. How did that come about? Was that a certain
Congress.
lawmaker that wanted to institute
Yeah.
that, or a group of people? Do you know
The
anything about
story, we always have to start with, you know, what the story is versus the facts. And we'll have to start with the story because I don't know all of the facts. My understanding is basically the Clinton administration floated the trial balloon about having the Pentagon being torn down. And as a result, the Republicans in Congress basically retaliated by having it declared a national landmark. And once it is declared a national landmark, basically you're very limited as to how much changes you can make to the exterior of the building. The idea was that they didn't trust the Clinton administration to basically, you know, create a good building or a better building or put the technological changes they needed. So they basically forced them to keep it the way that it was and actually spend more money in the revitalization of the Pentagon.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Any other questions that I can try to answer?
No, I think that does it. I really appreciate your time. This is awesome. If you joined us late, we did try and stream this on our Facebook page, Washington, D.C. History and Culture. It looked like it was successfully going through there, but sometimes there's some technical glitches. So I'll check after we get done to make sure that's still going okay. But if you missed a portion of the program, or if you want to watch it again or send it to someone you know, it should be on our news feed for our Facebook page. And the name of our organization again is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. And Deirdre, thank you so much. It's interesting because I went on your in-person tour and I thought it was really fascinating, but I like this online version as well because you can talk about and do things a little bit differently than you can in person. And again, if people get a chance, once things return to normal, which they will sooner or later, and if you're in the DC area, either permanently or for a visit, you should really go on a tour of the Pentagon. It's a really fascinating tour and very well done by the military personnel there.
Oh, and if I can make a pitch for the 9/11 memorial, obviously there are a lot of memorials in Washington, D.C., and a lot of them are focused in D.C. Versus the 9/11 memorial is located at the Pentagon. So unfortunately, it's one of those not as much visited, and it's a shame because as you can see, it's absolutely beautiful, especially just as dusk comes on. So when it was first set up, these trees were kind of stubs, but now, of course, they're in full bloom. Especially this time of year, the leaves are color, and it does get dark in Washington, D.C. right around 5:15 or so. But it is extremely beautiful just as sun is setting to go to the 9/11 memorial, and you really get a sense as to what the architects were trying to achieve, and the sense of peace that you do get from visiting the 9/11 memorial just as dusk arrives.
And people can go there on their own. They don't need any special reservation because it's outside and you can just walk over there and check it out.
Correct. And people always ask about parking. Basically, if you go kind of after hours, you kind of just park your car and don't say anything and they'll let you. But if you go, you know, during the day, there's no parking available. You know, every spot in the parking lot of the Pentagon is usually taken. You can also take the metro to either the Pentagon or to basically Pentagon City Mall, and it's about a half a mile walk from there.
Yeah, you'd probably, if you're driving, you probably want to go on the weekend because as you mentioned, there's workers there during the week,
always.
So Monday through Friday.
So there's workers there all the time. There's just less workers on the weekends.
Yeah, so the parking's easy. And then just if you're not familiar with that area, so it can be confusing to some people because there's 3 metro stops that are all in close proximity.
Yes.
One of them is called the Pentagon, which is this one. There's another one that's called Pentagon City, and then there's a third one called Crystal City. So sometimes when I talk to people, they get mixed up, and you know they went to Pentagon City and they were supposed to go to the Pentagon or vice versa. So again, the 3 metro stops in that area are Pentagon City and Crystal City. So you're looking for the Pentagon Metro exit. You can go to the other 2, but you just have a further walk.
Now, basically, the Pentagon Metro is on the other side of the building. So they were on the western facade. Basically, the Pentagon Metro stop, which you can go to, it is open to the general public. It is on the other side of the Pentagon. And the Pentagon building was at one point the largest office building in the world. It is huge. You think it's big until you basically are trying to walk around it and you realize how big it really is.
I'll see if I can, I'll email everyone and thank them for joining. I'll see if I can email them like the link that has the pictures from when you did the in-person tour. So I'll see if I can do that. I won't be able to do it tonight, but I'll try and do that tomorrow for those that are interested.
And again, I appreciate everybody's attendance for today's training. I think that, did we ever put up those poll questions?
Oh, gee, God, you had me so captivated. I completely forgot about that. Let me.
Okay, I think I can launch the poll.
Yeah, let me cue these. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yep. So I don't know if people have, we're just kind of curious as to how many people logged on today and how many of those are within the area or international or so forth. So if you do get a chance to vote in our poll, we would obviously greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry, you had me so captivated. I forgot all about that part of my job.
No, I forgot about it too, to tell you the truth. So we'll give a few more minutes to vote.
Yeah, I think we got up to.
Are there any questions in the chat room that I can try to reopen?
Hold on,
or I can try to answer?
No. Checking it. So it looks like half the people are in the DC area and the other half are from somewhere else, including 4% international. So that's really cool. And then I do have one. I'm just curious to know how many people have actually been to the 9/11 memorial. So let me see if I can.
And let me see if I can launch the second one. Maybe not. Okay, poll question number 2. I think I know how to do this. Okay. Launching. I think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, so just curious to know how many people have been to the memorial. Sorry, we were going to ask this earlier, but just kind of curious to know. We asked these questions in some of our presentations, really fascinating. The answers are all over the map in terms of the response rate. So it looks like this one, it's trending. Most of the people have not been to the memorial, which is interesting because there was about 50% of the people live in the DC metro area, but it's currently trending almost 80% have not been to the memorial. Here, let me go ahead and I'll share the results. So what this tells me, there's a lot of people in the DC area that haven't been able to get down to the memorial witness yet. So hopefully.
Well, I do know that everybody's, risk factors are a little bit different, but the good thing about the 9/11 memorial is that it is outside. So it, unlike, museums or other things, which can be a little crowded, this is probably a site that is worth seeing. And even in COVID times, I think it's not going to be as busy and it's not going to be as full as, let's say, going downtown. So we obviously encourage people, if their risk factors allow them, to do make that visit is worth doing.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, thanks, Deirdre, with this awesome information. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great weekend. And don't forget that Veterans Day is this coming Wednesday, November 11th. So if you get the chance, thank some of our vets. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.